further ado, I'd love to bring on our guests, Kristie and Enrique. Kristie Cabrera is a queer, Latinx, neurodivergent, accessibility, and inclusivity consultant with a background in occupational therapy and a passion for disability justice. Kristie supports organizations that focus on food sovereignty and nature preservation to improve their practices around accessibility and inclusivity. This work includes guiding individuals and organizations to unpack ableism, reflect on views of their body and mind, and understand accessibility and inclusivity beyond the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And also to create improvements to their organization's physical design and educational curricula and work culture. Kristie is also the program manager of Kid, an organization that facilitates inclusive culinary programs for neurodivergent teenagers. As an occupational therapist in a private school, Kristie offers therapeutic services to children with disabilities. Kristie, we are so excited to have you with us today. Joining Kristie is also Dr. Enrique Salmón. Enrique is a professor of American Indian Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at California State University, East Bay. He is a Raramuri Indian who has dedicated his studies to ethnobiology, agroecology, and ancestral ecological knowledge. Enrique is the author of Eating the Landscape, a book focused on small-scale native farmers of the greater Southwest and their role in maintaining biocultural diversity. He recently published Awigura, The Kinship of Plants and People, an ethnobotany of 80 plants important to American Indians, and has also published articles and chapters on Indigenous ethnobotany, agriculture, nutrition, and traditional ecological knowledge. He's a tribal liaison for the Cal State University East Bay. Enrique is also charged with the repatriation of Indigenous remains currently housed on the campus, with developing relationships between local Indigenous communities and the campus. Enrique, we are so grateful to have you joining us today. So, to start us off, I'd love to invite the both of you to set the table. Be a poem, song, photo, object, libation, ritual, prayer, breath. And for the listeners, just a little bit of context. This practice offers us the opportunity to be fully present, to think about how we want to be meeting each other for this conversation. In this virtual setting, it allows us to be intentional about how we set the context, about why we're here and what we're here for and what we're bringing, and to be able to bring our whole selves to this table. Kristie, would you like to start us off? Please share your name and also a visual description of yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Steph. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristie. I have light tan skin, long, dark brown, wavy hair. My hair is parted in the middle and flows down past my shoulders. I am wearing an olive green t-shirt, and in the background, you can see a bit of my kitchen, like my microwave. I would love to set the table by reading a paragraph from Alexis Pauline Gumb's book, Undrowned. To give some context, this book uses the knowledge and guidance of marine mammals to shed light, provide hope, and understanding to social movements. This paragraph is from the chapter 1, which is titled Listen. So I'll begin. So it says, how can we listen across species, across extinction, across harm? How does echolocation, the practice many marine mammals use to navigate the world through bouncing sounds, change our understandings of vision and visionary action. Is social media already a technology of bounce, of throwing something out there and seeing what comes back? This is where we start our trans-species communion, opening a space to uplift the practice of listening, even more than the practices of showing and proving and speaking up. Listening is not only about the normative ability to hear, it is a transformative and revolutionary resource that requires quieting down and tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristie, for encouraging and reminding us of what there is to listen to. Enrique, would you like to set the table for us?
Kuira, nehe ramori, nehe taripame chomari, nehe sawara, olonichi chokenyo. I am Enrique Salmón. I am Ramori. I am Parrot Clan, and I'm coming to you from Chochenyo Ohlone land here in San Leandro in the Bay Area. I've never been asked to describe myself in a virtual setting, but I'm an elder. If you can imagine what an elder looks like. My hair is gray to white at about shoulder length, but right now I have it pulled back in a sort of samurai bun is how I think of it. I wear glasses, and I think of my skin as African mahogany that has just been freshly sawed through. I'm sitting in front of a mural of corn. It's an old Mayan mural. And my offering, what I wanted to set the stage with is see if I can make this screen share work. Here we go. In case you're calling in, I've put on the screen a relief of a hand that was sitting on the ceiling of an overhang in a little cave in the northern part of Australia. It's a petroglyph. And you see the hand there, and then you see a couple of other of the old 40,000 years petroglyphs kind of imposing themselves on the edge of the hand. What this is about is I was once part of an Indigenous exchange in New Zealand and also in Arnhem in Northern Australia. We had gone to the Garma Fest, which happens every year. And we were invited to go out to see some of this rock art. And it was, like I said, up in Arnhem, in the top end of Australia. And before we could go into this little cave, there was an elder there named Lefty. And he said, in order for us to be allowed into this, to see this rock art, we needed to be introduced to the land. And so we proceeded to the edge of this creek, and he pulled this old enameled cup out of his pocket, and he filled it with water from this creek, and he drank from the cup, and then he immediately turned around and he sprayed the water all over our faces and our bodies. Now, in most situations in today's modern society, we would have immediately been offended. But as an Indigenous person, I realized that we were in ceremonial space. And in ceremonial space, everything changes. Portals into other dimensions of reality are opened. And this is what had happened. Lefty immediately told us that by spraying the water on us, we have now been introduced to the bees and the insects on the land. That in order for us to be able to, fully enter into this space to see this incredible rock art, the insects and the bees needed to know us first. And that is so indicative of an Indigenous approach to place and to becoming and belonging in relationship to a place. It's more than just your wanting to be there. The land needs to also know who you are. And so when I think of these topics that we're hopefully going to be covering and discussing and dialoguing over today, this is what immediately comes to mind.
Thank you, Enrique, for bringing Lefty into this space and this experience of getting to know, and the land getting to know you. Whew. I feel like there was already quite an introduction to the both of you. I'd love to dig deeper into this introduction, and I love the way that Enrique, you had offered how to be introducing ourselves. And so I would like to invite the both of you to tell us about the people and the lands and places that you belong to, the people that feed you, supply your energy, your chosen people, and how where you belong to and who you belong to has shaped the work that you do. Enrique, would you like to start us off here?
Who are my people? My people are skateboarders. My people are old surfers who get sore arms because they paddle too hard out there off of Bolinas. My people are fly fishermen. My people are folks that like to just go out and hang out by the bay and listen to all the animals, the birds, the harbor seals, and so on. My people are my students who come to my classes just with empty teacups, just ready to learn everything they can and to ask questions when they need to understand a little bit more. My people are fellow academics who fully see that as academics, we can no longer just helicopter into an Indigenous community, learn and take what we want after 18 months and leave. We need to apply what we learned for the people themselves and for those lands that we're working around. My people are people who love dogs and likes, listening to dogs because they have so much to tell us. They are so always in the moment. And I like to try as much as possible to always live my life in the moment, being present with what's happening right now.
Kristie, would you like to share a little bit about who you belong to, where you belong to?
Yeah, definitely. So I've struggled with this question for a while now, and I think it's because the word belong makes me think of other words instantly, like acceptance and comfort and home. And, I had a little bit more of a literal reaction when being presented with this question. And I was like, well, I've been living on Lenape land, specifically in New York City, for all my life, but I wouldn't say I belong to this land here. And I would never say I belong to Puerto Rico either, which is where my ancestors are from. And, in both of those cases, there's this feeling of not being accepted or comfortable or at home, from like the difficulty of feeling belonging in New York City, where it's really loud and this concrete space, to, being a queer, non-Spanish speaking person who didn't grow up on an island when I'm at Puerto Rico. So I felt a lack of belonging in those spaces. But I feel like I have so much to learn from Enrique. And like, when I was thinking about this question, it reminds me of like how I feel belonging when I'm near a river or the mountains or the trees, and to non-human beings that are often neglected, but serve so much value. So like the pigeons in New York City and snails and worms, I feel a really deep connection to the underdogs. And I have, this mental image that I've been having for years now of being in a waterfall space that leads to a river with a small, like, young child. And I go back to this image quite often, and it feels like a memory, even though I've never experienced it in this lifetime. And that feels like home and like my people, my community. So I'm still working out what it means to belong and figuring out my own ancestral history. But, those, I so far have established relationships with mostly non-human beings in my lifetime so far. So yeah.
Thanks, Kristie, for sharing about how complex belonging can feel, and helpful to dive in and move us into the next question about more about how we can expand our understanding of belonging. Dominant culture conditions us to think in the binary, and in this case, conditions for belonging or othering, shaping who gets to belong to the land. But we know that we all deserve a home, and that we all belong to the land, and that we need to be shifting away from this dominant narrative of binaries to create space for more, to create space for everyone, including those snails. And including people of all abilities. And so I'm curious to hear a story from the both of you about an experience that rejects this dominant norm, that makes it hard for us to feel like we belong, and to be able to witness the possibility and potential of living beyond this binary into this multicolored, multifaceted area. Enrique, I'd love to invite you in to share a little bit more about that and potentially trickster consciousness that you had named in previous conversations.
Yeah, you bring up one of my favorite topics of trickster consciousness. And a lot of folks get this idea that trickster is always just coyote, just someone that causes problems and gets in trouble and so on. Or maybe in the Pacific Northwest, it's the character might be a raven. But trickster is more than just a troublemaker. Trickster, in fact, I even have trouble with the word trickster, but it's now the word that we apply now for this sort of recognition among Indigenous communities around the world of that gray space that occupies everything around us, and that we at the same time occupy and can see. And we know it's there, but it's hard to often, to enter into it and to fully live within it. There was a number of years ago when I was spending a lot of time, as much as I could, going to powwows. And every year in March, there's the first big powwow of the year. It's part of the circuit that goes all the way until October. It was the March powwow in Denver. And after that, it's the Gathering of Nations in Albuquerque. And there's a bunch of powwows in between. There's Red Earth and so on. Anyway, I was at a July powwow in Taos. And it was an outside powwow, really incredible. You can see the Sangre de Cristo mountains behind there. And it was on this big, huge, what used to be the buffalo grounds. There's grass going everywhere, all the way to the foothills, to the mountains. And we were outside, circled by teepees, and in the middle was the dancers. And there was an intertribal dance going on, meaning everyone can come and join in, going in the circle in clockwise direction. And there were folks from all nations dancing with their regalia and feathers and beads and so on. Going in the opposite direction was this tall person in mostly white regalia with long black hair and standing proud, but dancing in the opposite direction. And everyone was giving this person space. And as I looked closer, I realized it was a two-spirit dancing. Someone who, among indigenous peoples, who can sometimes be considered a trickster character, someone who helps us to see in non-binary, non-polarized kind of view. And as this person moved in the opposite direction, like I said, everyone was giving them space, but at the same time, sometimes just kind of brushing their hands next to the person, sometimes actually touching the person. Because in that ceremonial space, in that moment, this person has power, the power to heal, the power to help us see other dimensions of reality, to open up portals, as I mentioned before. That's what Trickster does. Trickster helps us to see those other places that we know are there, we don't always recognize and aren't always sometimes prepared to see. And in just about every indigenous ceremony, there's going to be that recognition of that gray space. If you go to an Apache girl's puberty ceremony in the White Mountains of Eastern Arizona, there'll be gong dancers. They're mountain spirits, and there's always four, but there's always a fifth dancer that's decked out all in gray to represent that gray space, that other dimension. You go to Pueblo dances, there will be sacred clowns who aren't just there to be funny and to make fun of people. They help us to recognize that in-between space that surrounds all of us. And so, that example, whenever, as Stephanie asked, when I asked us to think about non-binary conditions in thought and beingness, I always think about that two-spirit going in the opposite direction at that powwow. Is just so incredible. I think if I had been ingesting some peyote at the moment, I would have seen rays of light connecting that person to the stars. But it wasn't that kind of ceremony. That's another one. I'll stop there.
Kristie, I'd love to invite you in here and share an experience for you that stretches beyond this binary into this gray space. That I think something I'll just also add is there's an in between, and there's also the potential that maybe either or isn't great, and stepping out of maybe something in between and even something beyond that too.
My mind is just, yes, this is Kristie. My mind is just firing from what Enrique shared. And I just love that visual. You gave us so much. And what's coming up for me is just like how when we all claim our authenticity, how we can all be that gray space in one way or another in someone's journey. But I'll put that aside for just a moment to share a little bit about my story. So I would like to share just an overall awareness that I've gained over the years from working in disability justice and how this has come up for me. And what I've learned is that nearly everything in our world, especially in the United States, was designed, after colonizers came and invaded, was designed for non-disabled people. And that is because our history, is ableist, among being racist and sexist and other things. And this ableist society encourages us to think in a binary. And most of the time, we don't even realize it. We just assume how things should be because that's how we have always seen it done. And we can take growing food as an example. If you were to research how to grow food, you'll mostly find information from non-disabled people who are farmers or gardeners, and find gardening and farming products that were designed by non-disabled people. If you were in a room with people who had growing food knowledge, most people would seek out people who aren't visibly disabled to receive information on growing practices. We all have this visual representation of who a farmer or gardener is in our mind. And disabled people grow food, and they have great practices, and they want to grow food. And when we seek knowledge from disabled people about growing food, we realize, wow, there are so many different ways that we can receive gifts from the land. And disabled people have identified various ways to do this, from intentionally selecting food that supports the places their body can access, like food that grows tall, beans, squash, and cucumbers, to focus on plant relationships, like using the three sisters of corn, bean, and squash, and other combinations to maximize small spaces in order to preserve energy. And those are just two examples. And there's so much more out there. And, my goal, unless somebody else wants to take it on, is to one day have the capacity to archive all of this information, because there isn't a collection of it, and it's great wisdom. And I started by this project called Growing Food in This Body, but these things take time and energy, so that's currently on pause. But I'm still always looking out and listening to the disabled people around me, and even embracing my neurodivergency when it comes to growing food. And I hope that's something that all of you are inspired to do as well after today.
Thank you, Kristie. Enrique.
Can I add to that? Because this is really, this is an important area for our whole society, our modern society, to look into. My wife's a hairstylist, and a number of years ago, she stopped doing hair color with her clients because she was realizing that hair color is one of the it's incredibly carcinogenic, and among professions, people who work in salons are extreme, just more exposed to these kinds of toxins than other people. And she's been on her own personal mission to get women, especially, to stop coloring their hair because it is so toxic. But we were just talking a little bit about an hour ago, I think we were talking about this, and I brought up Rachel Carson and how in 1962 she warned the rest of society about the dangers of pesticides and herbicides and pollutants in general and so on. And my wife asked me, what if back in 1962 we had listened to Rachel and changed the way we grow food? What would it have looked like? And my wife's good at that. She's always asking those kind of questions. And I was thinking, yeah, what if in 1962 we had stopped this industrial approach to growing our food and actually listened to the early permaculturists and regenerative agriculturalists and found ways to produce our food that actually worked with the lands where we were growing this food, as opposed to imposing these food systems on these lands? What if we had listened to folks who had different ways of envisioning how to grow food and adopted some of those techniques? And I often, when I listen to Kristie, I often think about what disruption, and in this case, a kind of one of the various kinds of disabilities presents to us. It isn't, our society looks at it as if it's something that we need to avoid and ignore. But in this case, disruption often or from disruption often emerges diversity, often emerges new creative ways of doing things, new possibilities. And I just wonder if, what kind of possibilities disabled farmers can offer the rest of us, or just backyard gardeners, finding different ways to work, outside of this imposed system that industrial agriculture places on all of us.
Yeah. I love the what ifs. I love how in this moment we can be exploring those, and what Rachel Carson has shared in the 1960s could be brought into the present moment and into the future. And I'd love to explore how language supports those what ifs. Both of you spoke to cultural lived expressions of belonging and what that looks like. And language is certainly a part of shaping our understanding of our world and our place in it, and how much of our Western language puts us in boxes. And so I'd love to explore how language can hold this gray area, this multicolored, multifaceted area that makes space for these what ifs and these possibilities. And so I'm curious how each of you have approached language as a tool to create this bigger we. Kristie, would you like to get us started there?
Yeah, definitely. This is Kristie speaking. I also just want to uplift something that Enrique said, and you used the word like your wife had said, which is, what if we would have listened? And that reminds me of, the paragraph I brought in to set the table about listening, and that last sentence, how listening is a transformative and revolutionary resource that requires quieting down and tuning in, and how much of our society doesn't allow us to quiet down and tune in, and that listening doesn't always mean listening to speech or words, right? It could be the mammals that are using echolocation. It could be our nonverbal friends. It could be just listening to the land. So thank you for sharing that. And to answer your questions, Steph, about language. Language is so very important to disability justice, accessibility, and inclusivity work. And my understanding of what it means to be disabled has evolved over time. And I know now that disability, that term we use to describe a certain group of people, is not a bad word, and that people have been pushed to use other words in order to avoid their discomfort, right? Like special needs, differently able, disability, everything else but disabled, because of the discomfort we have with variations of the human body and the mind. And now I know that disability is a natural part of human experience. It is normal. And disabled people are just as worthy as non-disabled people. So we don't have to cover that word up. And I forgot the person who coined this term, but I also embrace the word pre-disabled, the idea that most of us are in this place where we may not be disabled now, but because disability is a part of the human experience, we will one day be disabled. And that's okay. I also think about how the word disabled has been used as a weapon throughout US history, how people have used the words disabled to call someone disabled to get what they want, which is usually power or money, right? So calling women disabled in order to keep them as second-class citizens, right? They're too feeble-minded. We can't have them gain power. To keeping Black people in slavery. They won't be able to engage in life if they're not slaves. Preventing immigrants from relocating to certain states. There were people who would check the people who were coming into states on the coast to make sure that they didn't look disfigured, because they thought that if they let disabled people into their state, and states are always competing with one another, the government would have to spend money in order to take care of them. We have things like the ugly laws that prohibited, quote unquote, deformed people from being present in public spaces. And then our history with institutionalization, where disabled people are involuntarily forced into institutions for treatment because there's this desire to have them conform to what we consider normal, because we're so uncomfortable with the variety of human experience. And that's not a thing of a past. Just recently, Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, has pushed for institutionalization again in New York City, where people who appear mentally ill, regardless if they are at risk of harming themselves or other people, can be involuntarily institutionalized in a hospital. And that raises a lot of questions, right? Like, what perceptions are we thinking about? Who is mentally ill? What does that look like? Who's going to be impacted? Mostly people of color, disabled people. Can hospitals even take this capacity on, especially when we have other situations happening with COVID and other viruses and hospitals at capacity? It's a decision that was made in order to weaponize certain people, to push forward an agenda of power. And with that being said, I just encourage everyone to unpack what that word means for them, disabled, to sit with those feelings that come up, to learn about disability history, right? And see how powerful that word is, because when a word changes throughout history so much, that means that word has power and it's connected to every other social injustice, because people use words, again, to like weaponize. So I encourage you all to think about what is the disability history of the US, of my state, and where my ancestors come from.
Thank you, Kristie, for bringing attention to our emotions and the feelings that are evoked and the connotations behind those words. And Enrique, I know that you've even created new language to hold this gray, this non-binary, what we don't have a language for, like concentric ecology. And so I'd love to hear more from you about your approach to language and concentric ecology.
Where to begin? Our words have energy. One of my mentors, N. Scott Momaday, once suggested that when we afford a thing a name, we give it beingness. And that's because when we speak, our voices are giving voice to the entire universe. We are the universe. And the universe only exists because we as human beings think about it and speak about it. And we sign about it. As I watch our ASL interpreter here, that's another part of that, how we bring this energy of the universe to our temporary existence here. But even that is not temporary. We just move on to another plane of reality afterwards. And so, that's the position I come from when we speak. It's the energy of the earth and the whole universe giving beingness to things immediately around us. I was once part of a group of authors who were brought together in Crested Butte, Colorado for a retreat. And there were I can remember maybe about 20 of us. And the whole intention was for us to dialogue over the concept of wild and wilderness. And afterwards we were to leave, and we had, I can't remember, 6 or so months to write a chapter for this book. And in fact, I have the book right here. It's called, I'm not sure you can see it. Anyways, here we go. Anyways, called Wildness. relations of people and place. And during the dialogue, after I think on the third day, I was in the circle with everybody, and I finally said something that's been bothering me. And I said, well, in my people's language, there's no word for wild. We can't envision that concept of wilderness, of a place where humans are separate from the landscape itself. That's because for Native peoples, we are the land. The land is us. I was once on top of one of the Hopi mesas. We were watching the women's basket dance in October, and there was a late thunderstorm coming across the dry landscape from the San Francisco peaks. And one of my Hopi friends next to me said, we are that rain. That rain is us. It's repeating the same concept. And that thought has always lived with me. And then when back around, it was about 22 years ago, I guess 23 years ago, another Native friend of mine, Dennis Martinez, and I were pondering this concept and trying to figure out how can we write something, present something so that non-Native peoples can understand how Native peoples look at this relationship beyond just, explaining it and laying it out for people. And we both agreed that one of the central components of this is this idea that for Native peoples, everything around us is a relative. Not just metaphorically speaking, but the trees, the plants, the animals, everything are direct relatives. It's like our human aunts and uncles and cousins. They're just humans in a different form. Or look at it the other way, we are corn in a different form as human beings. And so we realize, yeah, this is they're our kin. We share kinship with them. And that's when, not too long after, I came up with this article I wrote for the Ecological Society of America, and I came up with this concept of kincentricity. For Native peoples, our ecological relationships are based on this concentric ecological relationship where we share breath with everything around us. We share, another word for breath in my people's language is iwi, or to borrow from the title of my latest book, Iwigara. That's this notion of sharing breath with everything around us. And when a culture understands that idea that everything around us is a direct relative, it has a direct impact on the choices we make, has a direct impact on the practices we use for managing our landscapes. And for Indigenous peoples, it's the reason why when Europeans first came here, this whole continent, both North and South America, were this big, huge gardens. They weren't these quote unquote pristine landscapes that Europeans thought they were seeing. They were these carefully managed landscapes, just like people carefully manage their gardens in their backyards. But it's just working from a different perspective, where humans were seeing themselves as keystone species in different ecosystems, where if you remove the humans from the state of California, as what's happened here in California, where Ohlone and other Native peoples all throughout California have been removed from direct management of the lands, we have catastrophic wildfires. We have diminished diversity everywhere. And so going back to the original question, we need to reconsider our words regarding our relationship to our places, redefine what it means to be living in relationship with a place, as opposed to continuing to use that word wild. Or maybe redefine wild so that the notion of wild or wilderness includes human beings. And it's okay to leave more than just a footstep in the wilderness. that's so alien to native peoples. Or, we got to do more than just leave our footprints. We have to be a part of it. We have to engage with it. That means using the land, but using it in a sustainable way.
Mm. Thank you both for asking of us to be reflective of our language and the impact of how that shapes how we understand and how we interact with the world. Beyond language, I'd love to think about food and weave food into this conversation of belonging. I would love to explore how these experiences of working with food can cultivate a sense of belonging with each other and with the land. And so I invite the both of you to share a time when food, growing, making, teaching about it, sharing it, sparked a sense of belonging. Where were you? Who were you with? What was the context? Bring us into this experience. What did it feel like, taste like, smell like? Enrique, would you like to start?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. And I got prepared for it a little bit. I was thinking about a number of years ago. I wanted to, you can't see where I'm at, but just, a few feet away from where I'm at right here to my left, is this window that goes into my big backyard. And I have all sorts of things growing out there still. It's one of the great things about living in the Bay Area. You can grow things year round. But I had decided to expand some planter areas in my garden. And so I had brought this, I think it was a yard and a half of new soil, it was dumped right into my driveway in front of my house. And I was out there with a wheelbarrow moving the dirt back to my backyard. And we happened to have a new neighbor who moved in like a month or so before. And she was outside watching what I was doing. And they're immigrants from, I think it was from Taiwan. And she was really interested in what I was doing. And she's, in her broken English, she was asking me, you have a garden? And I tried to explain to her, and even took her to the back to show her what I was doing. And then she held up her finger and she said, as best she could, wait, she's trying to indicate, wait. And she ran away and went to her house. And she came back a little bit later and with these seeds, and this little jar of seeds. And she had like 3 different little jars of seeds that she brought to me. She must have been saving the jars, and she put these little seeds. And I didn't know what they were. She couldn't explain to me what they were, but I realized they're, just by looking at them from experience, there's some kind of squash seed. I've never seen any that were black like this. For those of you who might not see what I'm holding up, I have this little black, it looks like a big watermelon seed, but it's almost a ½ inch long. And so, she tried to explain to me, what to do and so on. So I went ahead and planted them. And it turns out that I was planting loofah. And I didn't realize that loofah is more than just something that you let grow and dry and use for in your bath and the shower. That when you pick them earlier, when they're only like 6 inches long, you can eat them. And then one of the other seeds was this huge giant squash. It must have been, like 1.5 feet long and maybe about, 8 or 9 inches wide. This big green striped sort of thing. Looked like a light colored watermelon, but oblong shaped. And it stretched for like 20 feet, the whole vine that stretched, took up most of my front yard. But, I think about your question and that moment because seeds for me are more than just something that I share that I hope to plant next year. They represent hope. And in this case, they represent expanding of my community. because so many people who have a new neighbor in our society are immediately, a little reticent, a little wary of new neighbors sometimes. But in this case, through the seeds, we became, lifelong friends, and we belong to the same community of seed savers. Because now I give her some of my seeds that I've grown of things I plant, every year I save things like this case, I save my Italian parsley. My wife's Italian, so I have to grow Italian parsley every year. But I share it with her, and she likes growing that and adding it to her dishes. Seed saving community can go beyond just where you live in your neighborhood. I have a friend who every year from Colorado sends me seeds that she gets from different native communities. In this case, it was Yakima sweet yellow melon, which was incredible. And through this act of saving and sharing, we can create, even in an urban situation, a shared connection to a place. We can create an urbanized, alternative, spelling alternative with a capital N, alternative indigenous-tude, even in an urban area like San Leandro. In other words, we can become indigenous to a place through this kind of community building and creating this sense of belonging. And I encourage anyone who's listening and watching here to do that. And you don't have to have a garden to save seeds. You can just have a bunch of terracotta pots in your front porch and the balcony of your apartment and grow things and save those seeds, share them with your neighbors. You can do like this elder woman in San Jose does, where she creates new soil in her terracotta pots through this process that she uses by layering compost from her kitchen with newspaper and cardboard, and then planting a jalapeno in there. And over time, you create new soil. You create a new kind of space that you can become related to just in a terracotta pot. Our minds are incredible tools for imagining. And this is just one, you don't have to actually be a native person long born and lived through generations in a place to become indigenous to a place. We can create this in ourselves through this belonging, through a community, and with growing things.
Thank you, Enrique. Indigeneity through alternative practices. Kristie, I'd love to pass it to you to share a story about belonging.
Yeah, this is Kristie speaking. I also just want to add, I think seed gifting is such a love language, and it's something that makes me so happy. So I was just smiling the entire time that you were sharing your story, Enrique. And it reminded me of how I started working in disability justice and its connection to the food world. And I'm an occupational therapist, so I work in schools mostly. And at the time, I was so depressed working in a school that just did not align with my values. And we had a sensory bin, and a sensory bin is just a container with different things inside that have really strong sensory elements that kids can just put their hands in and explore. And the majority of the things inside the sensory bin were beans. They were all different kinds of beans. Because if you just stick your hand in beans, it's like this amazing experience. And one day I was feeling really bad at work, and I was like, I'm going to steal a bean from the sensory bin. And I took the bean and I went to my roof, which I'm not allowed to do. And I've gotten caught twice already, and I'm banned from gardening on my roof because of it. But I went to my roof and I planted the seed, and watching it grow brought back so many childhood memories of being curious and just absolutely in love with staring at plants and looking under leaves and the excitement to just show up every day and see how plants evolve. And that was the beginning of me being like, wow, I need to pivot from like working in a traditional school and find a place, because like I can't, like, once I was re-exposed to my love for nature, my love of beings, I couldn't stop. And here I am today. So thank you for sharing that story and a reminder as to how I started. And what I want to share is about my experience working in a school now, where I'm in a school that align with my values. And I work in a school for disabled children. Most of my kids use wheelchairs to varying degrees, and they use alternative forms of communication. So they can use an eye gaze device or communication boards to socialize. And my students eat, and they love eating. And our lunch period looks really different than probably most lunches that most people have seen. So we have therapists like myself working with students on holding utensils, requesting water with their devices, on chewing skills. We have other students who receive nutrition through a G tube, which is a tube that gets inserted from the outside of your stomach to the inside of your stomach and allows nutrition to go directly into your stomach, so they don't use their mouth for consuming food. And what that means is that every single one of the kids there have a unique relationship with food. And my job is to support this relationship. And that requires understanding that food is important to human life, and making sure that the amount of care I give myself when I'm eating and when I'm eating with my loved ones is the same care I give to my students and their experience with food. And what I often find is that non-disabled people who are supporting disabled people with eating rush, force them to eat faster than necessary because they want to get it over with. They don't check in with disabled people about how they want to spend their time in this dynamic together. They often avoid conversation or just talk at the disabled person, especially if that person is nonverbal. There have people make comments about how messy the disabled person or child is eating, about their saliva management. And then once the food is done, it's just like whisked away. And there's not a moment to be thankful for the meal or check in. Like if you're having a meal with your loved ones, what do you do after you eat? You sit back, you unbutton your pants, you sigh, you comment on how delicious it was, you say thanks for your company, for this food. Where is that sense of belonging, of co-occupation, of co-eating this dynamic when we are treating and working with and being in relationship with disabled people? I mean, if you've ever been to a nursing home, you might see this where, you know, people are really just rushing through that experience and making it seem like it's a burden. And, you know, food can only create access to a sense of belonging if people have access to it. So like my goal is to create a collaborative space where my students can access their food, and I'm bringing this energy of supportiveness and kindness. And, you know, I could go on a rant about how I wish supermarkets and farmers markets and farms that have CSA and people that create culinary products, I wish that they would understand the power they have and how what they're doing is creating access for people to engage with their food. But if it's not accessible, if it's not inclusive, right, how are people going to create a relationship with food that feels right for them? And on, you know, the flip side, working as a program manager for a nonprofit where I create inclusive culinary programs for neurodivergent kids, I put so much intention into these programs because I know that for the neurodivergent teenager, neurodivergent kid, most likely their neurotypical families have put expectations on them on how they should engage in eating and cooking. And when they're in a program with me, I want them to build their own authentic relationships with food. And I'm just there to enjoy that experience with them. And there's so much to talk about with that, with this question, but I'll just end there.
Thank you, Kristie, for inviting us to critically think about these experiences around food and how they hold the essence of belonging. Joe just popped into the chat a question to listeners. What word or phrase comes up for you when you think about reweaving belonging through food? I'd also like to acknowledge time. We're 4 minutes until we wrap up. This will go just a couple minutes longer, and so just naming that if you have to leave, feel free to do so. We're wrapping up now. The way I'd like to wrap up is, instead of holding a Q&A, we like to flip the notion of a Q&A on its head, and instead invite Kristie and Enrique to pose a question to you all as listeners. And so Kristie and Enrique, what is one question or invitation you'd like to ask of folks here before we wrap up? Kristie, would you like to pose your question?
Sure, it's a bit of a long one, but I would like to invite you all to think of a meaningful activity involving food or nature, so the outdoors, and consider the privileges that you have right now that allow you to engage in this meaningful activity. And once you have it in your mind, I want you to identify those privileges and think about what it would be like if you couldn't engage in that meaningful activity anymore because the environment wasn't set up for your body or mind. And how would that make you feel? And once you've captured that feeling, which is probably a not so great feeling, I want you to imagine that you live in a supportive community and that the people around you are dedicated to making sure that you don't lose access to that meaningful activity. And if that brings any comfort to you, like I said before, pre-disability, disability, that's all part of natural experience. That's something that we don't always get a choice in, but we can choose to be in community with one another and to support each other and help one another engage in these meaningful activities in every aspect of life.
It's a big question to sit with. I invite you all to sit with on your own time. I'm going to pop that into the chat there for you all. Enrique, would you like to leave us with a closing question?
Well, to borrow from another Native mentor of mine, Vine Deloria Jr., he always reminded people that Indigenous peoples are responsibility-based cultures. We don't focus so much on our individual rights, but more about our responsibilities to everything and everyone around us. And we're also, as a result of that, we're constantly thinking about our choices and actions and the impacts they're going to have on generations after us. So with keeping that in mind, I leave everyone to ponder the idea individually. What kind of ancestor do you want to be?
What kind of ancestor do you want to be? Thank you, Kristie and Enrique, for sharing yourselves with us, your experiences, your people, and for these questions for us to continue to